The handcuffs bit into Marcus Thompson's wrists as Officer Ryan Hayes tightened them one notch beyond necessary. That extra click of metal against bone that served no purpose except to remind a man that he was powerless in this moment regardless of who he was in any other. The afternoon sun glinted off the patrol car's hood as three Philadelphia police officers stood in the parking lot of the Whole Foods on Walnut Street, chuckling among themselves while Marcus stood with his hands behind his back, his tailored charcoal suit jacket riding up awkwardly, his dignity being stripped away in front of 24 shoppers who'd stopped their Saturday errands to watch a black man being arrested for a crime he not only didn't commit, but that hadn't even occurred. Hayes's partner, Officer Christina Walsh, leaned against the cruiser, scrolling through her phone, while the third officer, a rookie named Derek Mills, radioed in the arrest with a voice that couldn't quite hide his amusement. "Dispatch, we've got the suspect in custody. Black male, approximately 6 feet, well-dressed, but that doesn't mean anything these days, does it?" Mills actually laughed into the radio. Marcus said nothing. He'd learned long ago that black men who protested their innocence too loudly during arrests often ended up with additional charges of resisting or assault on an officer. So he stood silent and still while Hayes patted him down with unnecessary roughness. While Walsh made a joke about expensive suits not preventing sticky fingers, while Mills took a photo with his phone that Marcus knew would end up on social media with some caption about catching the sophisticated ones. What none of these officers knew, what they would discover in approximately 4 hours when their shift ended and they reported to the courthouse for overtime on a different case, was that the man they were laughing at while he stood handcuffed in a grocery store parking lot was Judge Marcus Thompson, appointed to the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas 3 years ago, the same courthouse where Hayes, Walsh, and Mills would be appearing that evening to testify in an unrelated trial. The same judge who would be presiding over that trial, the same man who would walk into the courtroom wearing the black robes of his office while these three officers sat in the gallery waiting to take the stand. If that opening sent electricity through your spine, if you already know this is heading toward the kind of justice that restores your faith in consequences, then you need to hit that like button right now. Share this with everyone who's ever been judged by their appearance instead of their character, who's ever been assumed guilty because of the color of their skin, who needs to be reminded that dignity can't be taken, only surrendered, and that sometimes the universe delivers accountability so perfectly timed it feels scripted. Subscribe to Acts of Depth because we tell the stories about moments when assumptions shatter, when power reveals itself in the last person anyone expected, when the arc of the moral universe bends and you can actually see it bending in real time. Now let me take you back to understand exactly who Marcus Thompson was before he became the man standing in handcuffs while officers laughed, because that context makes what happens next hit with the force of divine intervention. Marcus Thompson had been born in North Philadelphia in a neighborhood where ambition was often mistaken for arrogance, and education was sometimes treated as betrayal of your roots. His mother, Diane Thompson, worked double shifts as a nurse at Temple University Hospital to keep Marcus and his younger sister in a 2-bedroom apartment that was clean and safe even when the block outside was neither. His father had left when Marcus was 7, a departure that was both sudden and somehow inevitable, leaving behind a void that Diane filled with the kind of fierce love that substituted for 2 parents through sheer force of will. Marcus had been a quiet kid who loved books more than basketball, a preference that earned him mockery from other boys in the neighborhood who couldn't understand why anyone would choose library time over street time. But Diane had understood. She'd grown up poor herself, had watched too many bright kids from her generation get swallowed by circumstances that were designed to consume them. And she'd made a decision that her children would have different options, even if creating those options required sacrifices that kept her working until her feet swelled and her back ached. Marcus had gotten into Central High School, one of Philadelphia's best public magnet schools, on a scholarship that required him to take 2 buses each way, but gave him access to teachers who actually believed he could become something beyond the limited options his zip code suggested. He'd graduated 3rd in his class. He'd gotten into Penn on a combination of academic achievement and financial aid that covered everything except the invisible costs of being the only black kid from North Philly in classes full of mainline students who'd never had to think about money or safety or whether their skin color would be held against them in ways both obvious and invisible. Law school had been Howard University, a choice Marcus made deliberately because he needed to be somewhere that understood him without explanation, somewhere that he could just be brilliant without having to also be exceptional at navigating white spaces that tolerated him but never quite welcomed him. He'd excelled at Howard, had graduated magna cum laude, had clerked for a federal judge who'd seen potential in Marcus that reminded him of his own younger self. That clerkship had led to a position at a mid-sized Philadelphia law firm that did civil rights work, representing clients who'd been wronged by systems that were supposed to protect them, but instead had crushed them. Marcus had spent 12 years as an attorney building a reputation for being thorough, principled, and effective. He'd won settlements for families whose loved ones had been killed by police. He'd gotten compensation for workers who'd been discriminated against because of race or gender or disability. He'd fought school districts that tried to push out students instead of educating them. And slowly, case by case, year by year, Marcus Thompson had become known as someone who believed in the possibility of justice. Even when the evidence suggested justice was a fairy tale, we told ourselves to avoid confronting how broken the system actually was. The judicial appointment had come 3 years ago when a seat opened on the Court of Common Pleas, and a coalition of civil rights organizations had lobbied the governor to appoint someone who understood how the law impacted real people instead of just abstract principles. Marcus had been 42 years old when he'd put on judicial robes for the first time, standing in front of a mirror in chambers that still felt too fancy for a kid from North Philly, thinking about his mother who'd worked herself into an early grave to give him opportunities she'd never had. The arrest had started with a misunderstanding that became a mistake, that became a humiliation, because at every point where someone could have paused and reconsidered, they chose assumption over inquiry. Marcus had stopped at Whole Foods after spending his Saturday morning volunteering at a legal clinic that provided free advice to low-income residents. He'd been in his car in the parking lot finishing a phone call with his sister when a white woman in a BMW had pulled in next to him and left her purse visible on the passenger seat while she ran inside for what she'd probably thought would be a quick shopping trip. 2 minutes after she'd entered the store, she'd come running back out screaming that her purse was gone, that someone had broken into her car, that she'd seen a black man in the parking lot who must have taken it. She'd pointed at Marcus, who was still sitting in his car ending his phone call, completely unaware that he was about to be accused of a theft that hadn't actually occurred because her purse was exactly where she'd left it, buried under a jacket she'd forgotten she'd placed there. But by the time she realized her mistake, she'd already called 911 with a breathless report of a car burglary in progress, had already identified Marcus as the suspect, had already set in motion a response that brought 3 police officers who arrived expecting to find a criminal and therefore saw one regardless of the evidence or lack thereof. Officer Hayes had approached Marcus's car with his hand on his weapon. Marcus had rolled down his window with his hands visible on the steering wheel, a position he'd learned from his mother, who taught him that black men needed to be extra careful around police because mistakes could be fatal. "Step out of the vehicle," Hayes had commanded. Marcus had complied. "Do you have any weapons?" Marcus had said no. "Do you have identification?" Marcus had reached slowly for his wallet, narrating every movement because he knew sudden gestures could be misinterpreted with permanent consequences. But Hayes hadn't looked at the identification that identified Marcus as Judge Marcus Thompson, with an address in a nice neighborhood and a bar association card that indicated he was a member in good standing. Instead, Hayes had immediately spun Marcus around and cuffed him, while Walsh and Mills searched his car for the purse that was currently sitting in the BMW next to them underneath a jacket. The woman who'd made the accusation had been standing to the side watching the arrest when she'd finally looked in her own car and found her purse exactly where she'd left it. "Oh," she'd said, her voice small. "Oh, I found it. It was under my jacket. I'm so sorry," I thought. But the apology had trailed off because what could she say that would make this better? That she'd thought a black man sitting quietly in a car must be a criminal? That she'd seen Marcus and made an assumption based on nothing except the color of his skin and the fact that he existed in a space where she'd experienced a moment of panic? Hayes had heard her admission that the purse was found, that there had been no theft. that Marcus was innocent of the crime he'd been accused of based on nothing except one woman's fear and assumption. A reasonable officer would have immediately removed the handcuffs and apologized for the mistake. But Hayes had already invested in the narrative that Marcus was a suspect, had already established dominance through the arrest, and removing the cuffs would mean admitting error in front of witnesses who were filming on their phones. So instead, Hayes had doubled down. We still need to verify his identity and make sure there are no outstanding warrants. Policy requires we transport anyone we've cuffed to the station for processing. It was a lie. Policy required no such thing. But it was the kind of lie that police officers told when they wanted to punish someone for the inconvenience of having been wrong about them. So Marcus had been placed in the back of the patrol car and driven to the precinct while Hayes, Walsh, and Mills joked in the front seat about the suspect in the expensive suit who probably thought he was better than everyone else, about how this would teach him that nobody was above the law, about how satisfying it was to bring down people who acted like they deserved special treatment. Marcus had sat in silence listening to them mock him while the handcuffs cut into his wrists and the humiliation burned in his chest like acid. At the precinct, Marcus had been processed like any other arrestee, even though there was no arrest, no charges, no legal justification for any of what was happening. He'd been fingerprinted, he'd been photographed, he'd been placed in a holding cell for 90 minutes, while the officers took their time verifying what his identification had already told them, that he had no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, no reason to be there except that 3 officers had chosen to turn a mistake into a power trip. When they'd finally released him with a dismissive, "You're free to go," that contained no apology for the wrongful detention, Marcus had looked at the 3 officers and made a decision. He could file a complaint that would likely go nowhere because police investigated themselves and rarely found fault. He could hire a lawyer and sue, a process that would take years and accomplish little except financial compensation that wouldn't address the underlying problem. Or he could wait, because Marcus knew something these officers didn't. He knew that Hayes, Walsh, and Mills were all scheduled to testify that evening in a case being heard in his courtroom. He knew they would walk into his domain, expecting to encounter a judge they'd probably appeared before, expecting the familiar ritual of testimony and cross-examination. And he knew that the moment they saw him sitting on the bench wearing the robes of his office, the balance of power would shift in a way that would teach them something no complaint or lawsuit ever could. Marcus went home and showered off the residue of the holding cell. He put on his judicial robes. He reviewed the case file for the evening trial, a domestic violence case where the defendant was accused of violating a protection order. Hayes, Walsh, and Mills were the responding officers who'd arrested the defendant when he'd shown up at his ex-wife's house, despite the court order prohibiting contact. It was a straightforward case that would normally take less than an hour, but this evening's proceedings would be anything but normal. Marcus arrived at the courthouse at 5:30, 90 minutes after being released from the police station where he'd been held without cause. His bailiff, a woman named Andrea, who'd worked with Marcus since his appointment, took one look at his face and asked what was wrong. Marcus told her what had happened. Andrea's expression shifted from shock to fury to something that looked like satisfaction. "Those officers are here. They're in the gallery waiting to be called. Judge, they have no idea." Marcus nodded. "I know, and I'm going to give them the opportunity to figure it out themselves before I address it. I want to see how long it takes them to recognize the man they arrested is the judge presiding over their case." He walked into the courtroom at precisely 6 p.m., the time the trial was scheduled to begin. The gallery was half full with people waiting for various cases on the evening docket. Hayes, Walsh, and Mills sat in the 3rd row wearing their uniforms, scrolling through their phones, completely unaware that their afternoon was about to become very complicated. Marcus took his seat at the bench and looked out at the courtroom. His eyes found the 3 officers who hadn't yet looked up from their phones. "All rise," Andrea announced. "The Court of Common Pleas for the City of Philadelphia is now in session. The Honorable Judge Marcus Thompson presiding." The courtroom rose as protocol demanded, and finally Hayes looked up from his phone to see which judge would be hearing the case he was testifying in. The recognition took approximately 2 seconds. Marcus watched as Officer Ryan Hayes' face went from bored indifference to confusion to horror as he realized that the man sitting on the bench wearing judicial robes was the same man he'd arrested 4 hours ago, the same man he'd handcuffed and mocked and thrown in a holding cell despite having no legal grounds. Walsh saw it next, her hand flying to her mouth as the connection solidified. Mills, the rookie, took longest to understand, but when realization finally hit his expression, shifted to something approaching panic. The courtroom settled into seats. Marcus let the silence stretch for several seconds, let the three officers marinate in the reality of what they were facing. Then he spoke in the voice he used when addressing his courtroom, the voice that carried authority earned through years of fighting for justice and now reinforced by the power of his office. Before we begin this evening's proceedings, I need to address a matter that affects three of the witnesses scheduled to testify tonight. Officers Hayes, Walsh, and Mills, please approach the bench. The three officers stood on legs that looked unsteady. They walked to the front of the courtroom where Marcus sat elevated on the bench, the physical representation of the power they'd abused that afternoon. "Officers, do you recognize me?" Marcus asked. Hayes opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Walsh nodded. Mills looked like he might throw up. "I'll take that as a yes," Marcus continued. "This afternoon, I was wrongfully detained by the three of you based on a false accusation that you failed to properly investigate before placing me in handcuffs. I was transported to your precinct despite there being no legal basis for arrest. I was processed and held for 90 minutes while you verified what my identification had already indicated, that I had committed no crime and was guilty of nothing except being a black man sitting in a car in a Whole Foods parking lot." The courtroom was so quiet that Marcus could hear the ventilation system humming. "During my detention, I heard the three of you mock me. I heard you make jokes about my suit and my situation. I heard you demonstrate the exact kind of casual cruelty that makes people lose faith in police officers who are supposed to serve and protect rather than humiliate and punish." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Now, I have several options for how to proceed. I could recuse myself from this case, though that would delay justice for the victim in tonight's proceedings. I could hold you in contempt of court for your behavior, though that would be personal rather than judicial. Or I could address this matter the way it should have been addressed this afternoon, with honesty, accountability, and a recognition that badges don't give officers the right to treat people as less than human." He paused. Hayes was sweating. Walsh had tears in her eyes. Mills looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Officers, you will testify in tonight's proceedings as scheduled because the case before this court deserves to be heard regardless of your conduct toward me. But after your testimony concludes, you will remain in the courtroom. I will be filing a formal complaint with your department about your actions this afternoon. I will be requesting an investigation. And I will be recommending disciplinary action, including mandatory retraining on constitutional rights, racial bias, and the proper conduct expected of officers who serve this city." Marcus sat back. "Do you understand?" All three officers nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," Hayes managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," Walsh added. Mills just nodded, apparently incapable of speech. "Sorry is insufficient," Marcus said. "Sorry is what you say when you step on someone's foot or arrive late to a meeting. What you did to me this afternoon was a violation of my civil rights. What you did was abuse the authority this city has given you. What you did was treat a citizen as guilty without evidence and mock him while he stood powerless in handcuffs. An apology doesn't address that." Marcus gestured for them to return to their seats. "We'll proceed with the trial. Officers, you'll be called when the prosecution is ready for your testimony. Until then, I suggest you think carefully about the oath you took when you became police officers and whether your actions this afternoon honored that oath." The trial proceeded with a surreal quality that everyone accused of violating a protection order pled guilty to the charges after his attorney advised him that fighting the case was futile given the evidence. Hayes, Walsh, and Mills were called to testify about the arrests they'd made. They took the stand one by one and answered questions in voices that shook slightly, acutely aware that the judge evaluating their testimony was the same man they'd humiliated hours earlier. Marcus was scrupulously fair in his conduct of the trial. He asked clarifying questions when testimony was unclear. He ruled on objections based solely on legal merit. He gave no indication that his treatment by these officers affected his judicial duties, because despite what had been done to him, Marcus Thompson was a judge first, and the role demanded impartiality, even when personal feelings suggested otherwise. The trial concluded with a guilty verdict and a sentence that fell within standard guidelines for protection order violations. Then Marcus turned his attention back to the three officers. Officers Hayes, Walsh, and Mills, please approach the bench again. They stood and walked forward with the gait of people approaching their own sentencing. I've given considerable thought this evening to how to address your conduct toward me. I've considered the various remedies available both through official complaints and personal action. And I've decided on a course that I believe serves justice better than punishment alone. Marcus pulled out 3 sheets of paper from a folder beside him. Each of you will write a detailed account of what happened this afternoon from your perspective. You will include the initial call, your approach to me, your decision to arrest despite the lack of evidence, your choice to detain me at the precinct, and the comments you made while I was in your custody. You will be honest about your actions and your thinking. You will reflect on whether your conduct met the standards you're supposed to uphold. He handed each officer a sheet of paper. These accounts will be submitted to me, to your commanding officer, and to the police department's internal affairs division. You will also attend a training program on implicit bias in constitutional policing, and you will spend 1 Saturday per month for the next 6 months volunteering with the Legal Aid Society's Police Accountability Project, where you will hear from citizens who've experienced the kind of treatment you subjected me to this afternoon. Walsh was crying openly now. Hayes looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Mills still appeared incapable of speech. Additionally, as Marcus continued, each of you will write a personal letter of apology to me, not a form letter, not something your union lawyer drafts, a genuine reflection on what you did wrong and how you plan to do better. These letters will be for my eyes only. They won't affect the official investigation, but they will affect whether I believe you're capable of learning from this experience or whether you're simply police officers who got caught and are sorry about the consequences rather than the conduct. Marcus looked at each of them in turn. Do you understand what I'm asking of you? All 3 nodded. Yes, Your Honor, they said in near unison. Then you're dismissed. I expect the written accounts on my desk by Monday morning and the letters of apology by the end of next week. Court is adjourned. The aftermath rippled outward in ways Marcus couldn't have fully predicted. The story of a judge being arrested by officers who later had to appear in his courtroom spread through Philadelphia's legal community within hours and hit local news within days. Marcus gave a carefully worded statement to the press that focused not on his personal experience, but on the broader issue of police conduct and the importance of accountability. What happened to me happens to countless Black men and women every day, he told the reporters. The difference is that I have a platform and power that most people don't. I have the ability to demand accountability in ways that ordinary citizens cannot, and I intend to use that platform to highlight not just my individual experience, but the systemic issues that make these encounters commonplace. The Philadelphia Police Department launched an investigation that was actually thorough for once, perhaps because the victim was a judge who couldn't be easily dismissed or intimidated. The investigation found that Hayes had a pattern of excessive force complaints that had been quietly settled or ignored. Walsh had been involved in 3 previous incidents of questionable arrests that had been dismissed without serious review. Even Mills, the rookie, had been the subject of complaints about his conduct during traffic stops. The 3 officers were suspended without pay for 30 days while the investigation concluded. Hayes was eventually fired after a 4th excessive force complaint was filed during his suspension. Walsh was demoted and transferred to a desk position. Mills received a formal reprimand and was required to complete additional training before being allowed back on patrol. But the individual consequences mattered less to Marcus than the institutional response. The Philadelphia Police Department, under pressure from the mayor's office and the public outcry generated by the judge's arrest, implemented new protocols for arrests. Officers were required to have supervisory approval before transporting anyone who hadn't been formally charged with a crime. Body camera footage would be automatically reviewed when complaints were filed, and there would be regular audits of arrest patterns to identify officers whose stops and detentions showed racial disparities that suggested bias rather than legitimate police work. The letters arrived over the following 2 weeks. Hayes's letter was defensive, full of explanations about why he'd made the choices he'd made and how he'd been following procedures that turned out to be flawed. It was clear that Hayes had learned nothing except that getting caught had consequences. Marcus filed the letter away with a sense of resignation about officers who saw badges as licenses for behavior they'd never tolerate from ordinary citizens. Walsh's letter was different. It was raw and honest and devastating in its self-examination. She wrote about growing up in a family of police officers where Black communities were discussed in coded language that taught her to fear rather than serve. She wrote about the shortcuts she'd taken over her career, the assumptions she'd made, the times she'd gone along with questionable conduct because speaking up would mark her as disloyal to the blue wall of silence. She wrote that seeing Marcus on the bench, recognizing the man she'd helped humiliate now sitting in a position of authority she'd never questioned he might hold, had shattered something in her that needed to shatter. "I thought I was a good cop," Walsh wrote. "I thought I followed the rules and treated people fairly. But I realized that day in your courtroom that I'd been participating in a system that dehumanized people, and I'd told myself it was okay because I wore a badge. I can't undo what I did to you, but I can commit to doing better going forward. I can commit to being the kind of officer I should have been all along, instead of the kind who arrests people first and asks questions later." Marcus read Walsh's letter 3 times and felt something shift in his chest. This was what accountability looked like when it worked. Not just punishment, but genuine reflection leading to changed behavior. Mills's letter was shorter, but equally honest. He wrote about being a rookie who'd followed the lead of more experienced officers because he'd been taught that questioning senior partners was a sign of weakness. He wrote about the moment in the courtroom when he'd realized the man he'd laughed at while taking a photo was a judge who held power Mills had never imagined. "I wanted to be a police officer because I thought it meant helping people," Mills wrote. "But that day I learned I'd been hurting people instead. I'd been so focused on following orders and fitting in that I'd forgotten why I took this oath. I'm grateful that the person we wronged had the power to teach us this lesson. I'm sorry it was necessary."